disease is the #1 killer of women in this country. 10 years ago,
osteoporosis and arteriosclerosis and cancer and autoimmune disease.
The number of people with diagnosed and undiagnosed diabetes will nearly
Surgeon
double.
General, this could be the first generation of children in the United States that lives less than its parents.
Heart disease, as far as I'm concerned, is an absolutely toothless paper tiger that need never, ever exist.
If everyone were to adopt this, I really believe we could cut healthcare costs by 70 to 80%. When I was young, we promoted our product because it was nature's most perfect food. But it took on a slightly different twist as time passed. I mean, it's the most perfect food for cats.
I mean, this was so provocative, this information. We could turn on and turn off cancer growth just by adjusting the level of intake of that protein.
Because they're all Chinese. Genetically, they are all the same. Why they have so much difference in single cancer mortality?
The ones they sent me were sicker than I had thought.
When I had the second heart attack, the doctor said I should prepare for death. I said, do you really want me to buy a rocking chair and just sit there and rock away and wait? And he just looked at me and he said, yes, that's just exactly what I'm saying.
On the one hand, I'm coming from the scientific route, getting some ideas. He's coming from the clinical route. Here's the science, here's the clinical evidence. Put the two together, it's amazing.
What goals do you have?
I want you to reverse all your medical diseases, the ones that we can reverse, and most of yours we could.
To me, the answer is just absolutely so simple, it's criminal.
The greatest gift that you could possibly give to your family, if you can make them be aware of the incredible power to avoid life's most painful events. You just don't have to have those kinds of events.
I can say this with a great deal of confidence, that our national authorities are simply excluding this concept of nutrition from the debate and the discussion in order to protect the status quo.
This could be the first generation of children in the United States that lives less than its parents.
I got 2 pills I take for my diabetes, then I got 1 for cholesterol, high blood pressure, and then I take Byetta, which is an injectable.
I'm getting really shaky and I'm sick and I'm fatigued, and that's when they diagnosed me with hypertension and diabetes.
Obesity, diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure cost this country more than $120 billion each year.
People are saying, you're crazy, you're a cancer patient, you should be resting. Doctors told me this.
When I had the second heart attack, the doctor said I should prepare for death.
Heart disease is an absolutely toothless paper tiger that need never, ever exist.
People who were raised in Japan, the Philippines, Korea, China, never had heart disease, prostate cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis.
This is the atlas of cancer mortality in China.
Virtually, the Western diet was non-existent. They had no animal products. They had no dairy, no meat.
We learned that we could turn on and turn off cancer growth just by adjusting the level of intake of that protein.
I knew at that point what caused most diseases.
Our national authorities are simply excluding this concept in order to protect the status quo.
With the Western diet, there are going to be 500,000 people in this country this year who will have to have the front half of their body divided, their heart exposed. Some people would call that extreme.
I know of nothing else in medicine that can come close to what a plant-based diet can do.
If you go through life thinking that what happens to you from a health perspective is based on your genes, you're a helpless victim.
I reversed the diabetes. The diabetes is not coming back.
I just can't understand what it's done to change my life.
Diet is so much more important than anybody ever thought.
To me, the answer is so simple, it's criminal. And it's just people starting to take responsibility for their health and starting to eat more plant-based foods. It's that simple.
having had a career in trauma surgery for a long time, and having had some of the rewards that come with that, eventually, sooner or later, you actually salvage somebody that probably wouldn't be here otherwise. But then my knees started to hurt. And so I became more interested in my initial subject that I really liked was biochemistry. And you go back to the basics and you find that instead of treating things, why don't we prevent them? And as most of you know, our medical system in this country is in bad shape. We spend a tremendous amount of money and we have poor results. And what we need to do is get back to the science. And the person probably most responsible for putting our medical system on the road in that direction is the speaker tonight. You saw the two people on these trailers. The other one is Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn. It's a Dutch pronunciation. I tend to do it in German. But anyway, I had the opportunity about a month ago to go spend some time with him. I called him and said, we want to use the diet that you promote for our patients. How do we do it? And he said, well, come and watch. And so I went and watched. And he's, as you see, somebody who's very passionate about what he does, but he's got answers. He's got the right answers. And as he said on there, he's the clinician. He's dealing with patients on a day-to-day basis. But the person that we're dealing with, we're able to listen to tonight, is just, as he said, a farm boy from Virginia who got interested in science and made a wonderful career out of that. And now his second career is getting out there and trying to teach all of us how to make these things happen. So without belaboring the point, I want to just say that it is a particular honor for me to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. T. Colin Campbell.
Thank you, Dr. Heitz, and thank all of you for coming tonight. It's really wonderful to be back in Portland again and see so many good faces interested. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, is that better? I've got two mics on here, so I guess one is right. Okay, good. If you can't hear me, please raise your hand as I go forward. I want to thank Peter Spendelow and Jill especially for making this arrangement, and it's a story that I've been in the field for a long time. I started my career now 55 years ago, actually, in graduate school at Cornell University, and have learned along the way that it has become a story that has many, many ramifications. And there's various and sundry ways to talk about this story, and I do talk about it in various and sundry ways. But tonight I have, I think it's 40 minutes, I believe. I'm going to go back to the core and basically share with you much of what's in the book, but that is basically a story of how I came to sort of learn what I think I learned with all my students and colleagues and others. When I sit down to write the book with my youngest son, who before was in theater, now he's gone through medical school, just graduated with his MD himself, we decided we'd try to figure out how to write the story. And I don't particularly like to preach or proselytize, but we finally decided on the idea, why don't I just tell the story the way I learned it and let the reader decide for themselves and maybe try it. And it's really turned out to be really quite a wonderful experience. So I'm going to just share with you a sort of a snapshot of some of the kinds of evidence that really influenced me to come to this particular point in time. The story starts out, for me at least, in a fairly narrowly focused question involving work that I was doing in the Philippines at the time. And gradually over time, it just sort of just went like that. And now, in fact, it's far more than just about, of course, vegetarianism or veganism. It's really about a whole lifestyle. And that's the message that I think all of us who are working in this field really want to convey. So this initial experiment was, as I say, was very narrowly focused. It was based on my observation of the Philippines, where we were working on the idea of trying to help in overcoming malnutrition in children, and discovering, in fact, that children there who were consuming, the few children who were consuming the most protein, more or less the level that we tend to consume in the West, they were the ones most likely to get a certain kind of cancer, primary liver cancer specifically. And so with that sort of rather simple observation, it wasn't published and so forth, with that simple observation, it turned out that some work in India using experimental animals at the time, also working on the same idea, trying to understand, if you will, how this primary liver cancer really started, did this particular study here, where they basically fed animals 2 different levels. Let me get my thing here right. Oh. They fed experimental animals 2 different levels of protein, because it was their view, quite independent of what I had seen myself, there was their view that liver cancer, and perhaps other cancers too, might relate to the amount of protein we consume. And it was their hypothesis at the time that levels of protein too low might actually turn on cancer. And so they did this little experiment and published it at the time in a fairly obscure journal, and got these results here. Namely, what they were able to show was that the animals given the good levels of protein, the 20% of total calories of protein, are the ones who actually got the cancer. 100% of them did, or precancerous lesions, as we say. The animals given the lower levels did not. I mean, that was a huge difference. And what was significant about this particular report, at least for me, was the fact that what these researchers were doing was equivalent to what I thought I was seeing in the children. In other words, higher protein intake associated with more cancer. That was a bit of a shock, because I had, from my own background, both involving my doctoral research at Cornell University, as well as just from the field in general, had always believed that protein was the most awesome of all nutrients. It is, of course, an important nutrient, but in this particular case, it turned out it was associated with an increase in cancer formation. So then those observations enabled me to come back with my students to organize a basic research program. First at Virginia Tech, and for the most of my career at Cornell University, a program that was funded by the National Institutes of Health, published extensively, that was to last for the next 27 years. We looked at this question: is it really true that protein can turn on cancer? And if so, how does it do it? So we studied it, as I say, in considerable depth and published a lot of stuff on it, and I just want to share with you just 2 or 3 observations that kind of capture some of the more significant parts of the story. Namely, if animals, for example, exposed to a carcinogen that gives rise to liver cancer, are fed 2 different levels of protein, either 20% of total calories or 5% in form of protein, you can see here over the first 12 weeks, in the early stages of the cancer formation, the animals fed the higher levels of protein, the good levels, the recommended levels, actually the cancer were growing quite well. The animals fed the lower levels didn't grow at all. I mean, that's a huge difference, really, and it was consistent with what, in fact, the Indian workers had done, and consistent, too, with what, in fact, I thought I was actually seeing in the children. So then we did a study to sort of ask the question, what happens if we sort of, as this sort of cancer is beginning to evolve, what happens if we switch the diets back and forth? And you can see here that when we feed the 20% protein for the first 3 weeks, the cancers are growing, we switch it to 5%, turn it off, turn it on, turn it off. In other words, it turned out that we could actually control whether cancer grew or did not grow. After having been established, we could control it just simply by adjusting the levels of protein intake. Now, don't want to leave the impression, however, that that protein is carcinogenic, if you will, or that protein, we need to ignore protein. That's not true. Protein is an essential nutrient. We all need protein. So this really becomes a question of how much protein. And so we did a little study just sort of comparing the levels of protein intake in the diet compared with, let's say, the cancer response. And you can see here that for levels ranging from 4, 6, 8, and 10% of total protein, the cancer didn't grow. It was only when these animals in this particular case had enough protein to sustain their good health and then exceeded that amount of protein, that's when the cancers grew. So when I say protein being associated with cancer, it turns out I'm really talking about protein consumed in excess of what we absolutely need. It turns out also, incidentally, that experimental animals and humans need about the same level of protein. So in a sense, this suggested that what we were looking at here was probably, could be, in fact, quite equivalent to the same kind of things you might see in humans. But nonetheless, we wanted to sort of look at this a little more carefully, and the amount of protein that we humans consume is actually in the range of maybe 11% to 22% or so. So most of us are consuming levels of protein in the range in which you might anticipate seeing this kind of response, at least for some folks. What I just showed you, though, was only the early stage of cancer. So then we did, cancer, incidentally, takes usually a lifetime to develop. In the case of humans and virtually any other species. And so we did a lifetime experiment, sort of repeating it in a sense, 5%, 20%, if you will, levels of protein. And after 100 weeks, which is a normal lifetime of animals in this particular case, the animals given the 20% protein had substantial amounts of cancer. The animals given the 5%, almost none did. I mean, that was, again, a huge effect. But what was also interesting was that the animals not getting the cancer, consuming a little more calories, by the way, at the end of the study were all living, thrifty, with sleek hair coats, energetic. And in fact, we spent some time actually doing various descendant experiments to sort of check that out. Because here, they're at the end of their lifetime and really appeared to be quite young and vigorous and, as I say, energetic, with no cancer. In contrast, the animals given the 20% protein, both sets of animals had the same exposure to the initiating, so-called initiating carcinogen event. The animals given the 20% protein, unfortunately, were all dead at 2 years with liver cancer. So here was this a huge effect between just 20% and 5% animals, if you will, not only in terms of how much cancer they got, but also in terms of sort of other general health characteristics. Now, it turns out that I had to ask myself at a particular point in time something about the protein we were using. I hadn't paid too much attention to this. I was more interested at the time, at least in the early part of my career, just trying to figure out how does cancer develop and how does it grow. That was more or less the purpose of much of my research. But the protein effect sort of came into view, as I just mentioned. But it turned out, along about this time, I said, what kind of protein is it we're using? We're using the protein, in fact, that we actually was on the marketplace. Most of us researchers were using that kind of protein. It turned out the protein we were using, when I started focusing on the question a little bit, I mean, this is about maybe 10, 12 years into my career. The protein we were using was casein. Casein, the major protein of cow's milk. I had been raised on a dairy farm. I actually did my doctoral dissertation, in fact, early on the question concerning how do we promote more consumption and more efficient production of animal-based proteins, so-called high-quality proteins. So all of a sudden, I was faced with a dilemma. I guess it wasn't really a dilemma, but something that was surely very provocative. Casein actually turning on cancer development. It also turns out, and that's me, incidentally, as I say, maybe 7 or maybe 9 or 10 years ago now, in the front of the... that was one thing that it was a bit of a shocker, if you will, sort of drew my attention actually considerably. We at this particular point in time had already established that this relationship really did exist. We knew a great deal how it worked. And insofar as how it works is concerned, in biochemistry, as Dr. Haidt just mentioned, we'd like to go to the basics of things. And so at this point in time, I had figured out, well, okay, we confirmed what the Indian workers had done, but we want to learn something about how does it work. This is really fundamental to actually the whole medical system in a sense. We like to know how things work, if you will. And so we set about trying to figure out what, as we like to say in science, we wanted to figure out what the mechanism was. Is it this enzyme, this hormone, this or that? So we got into the inside of cells, inside of the body, of course, and looked for things. And every time it turned out that we looked for the mechanism, we found one. That turned out to be for me at least, probably one of the most significant things I think we did over the years, because it tended to challenge even the way we think about medicine, the way it works, because it turns out it doesn't work by a single thing. These are just a list of a bunch of different sort of so-called mechanisms involved in the first stage, that's initiation, as well as the second stage, promotion. It turned out that, as I say, every time we looked for one, we found one. And in reality, when the protein is being increased above the levels that are useful, everything goes wrong, which sort of made the story that much more powerful, because it wasn't just one thing. It was telling us something about the way biology and our bodies really work when something happens insofar as the relationship between cause and effect is concerned. Having said that, we worked with casein, becoming aware of that. I also should tell you, too, that we tried 2 other proteins, soy protein and wheat protein, also fed at this higher level. It didn't turn on the cancer. So we were getting the impression early on that this might be something to do with animal protein in general, if casein was reflective of animal protein, as opposed to plant proteins in general. I mean, that wasn't a big sample, 1 animal protein, 2 plant proteins to make the case, but from lots of other kinds of research that I don't have a chance to really tell you here, we could, in fact, generalize about that and really confident of that kind of statement. Animal protein tends to turn on cancer. Plant protein tends to not do that, or in fact, possibly turn it off. In any case, casein being sort of the point of interest here, in more recent years, it turns out now that here's a publication that was just recently published in 2005, showing the relationship between cow's milk consumption, protein or casein, if you will, and breast cancer for different countries. One cannot conclude from a study like this, I should emphasize, that milk causes breast cancer from this kind of information. But we do have lots of other kinds of information, some of which came from the study that we did in China, to suggest that yes, milk consumption does in fact raise the risk for breast cancer. That's a pretty impressive relationship. Also, the same is true for uterine cancer. Different numbers, different points, if you will, but basically the same sort of relationship. So we see now some evidence coming forth that the increase in our consumption of animal protein-based foods do relate to some other kinds of cancer. I just showed you 2 kinds of cancer, reproductive cancers that we call it, or cancers of the reproductive tract, in the case of women. Us men don't get away without having a problem too. It turns out with prostate cancer, or reproductive cancer as well, here's a relationship, again, between non-fat milk consumption and prostate cancer for different countries. Non-fat milk, basically what that is skim milk, as I'm sure you're aware, low-fat skim milk kind of thing. Fat is not there. It's basically protein. So as milk or protein consumption is increased, overall, when you look at that kind of relationship, again, we see it's associated with prostate cancer. We also know quite a lot more about this now, too. There's a hormone that actually rises in response to the feeding of this kind of protein that tends to turn on cancer. So we're learning a lot more about this kind of relationship. But so I'm just so far focused just on the question concerning protein, and specifically casein and animal protein, if you will. I was interested at this point in time, because this information was so provocative, there had to be a big story here. This was not something was isolated. So we wanted to turn our attention then to expanding our horizon as we went forward. For example, here's a series of questions that tended to arise to give us this broader perspective. Casein might be representative of animal protein, as I mentioned. It is, of course, and I think that's a reasonable assumption. But then it's not just animal protein itself. Foods have all kinds of nutrients in them, as I'm sure you know. The animal protein effect might also be seen with animal foods in general, possibly. But then it's not just animal foods, it could also be plant foods. As we increase our consumption of animal foods and decrease our consumption of plant foods, which we now know actually tend to prevent cancer. So now we're in a bigger arena, looking at sort of the broad spectrum of foods. As one goes up, the other goes down. So it raises a sort of broader kind of question. We also then, too, want to know whether what I just showed you in experimental animal studies applies to humans. And lastly, so far I just talked about cancer, but finally we wanted to know, too, does this apply to other diseases as well? So now we're getting into some big territory, I think you would agree. We're talking about foods, we're talking about different kinds of diseases, health in general. We're talking about more than protein, I should tell you. We did other studies involving other nutrients. I'm just sort of touching on the highlights of one particular nutrient in this case. And it was about this time that in order to seek that larger perspective, we had the good opportunity to go to China, to explore with our Chinese friends how diet might relate to various kinds of diseases. The Chinese during the 1970s, 73 to 75, had gone across the country and measured how much cancer existed in a total of 2,400 counties. I mean, it was a mammoth study, a huge study. 625,000 workers, it was said to be. So they, in 1973 to 75, came up with an atlas that was published in 1981, showing how much cancer existed for about a dozen different cancers around the country. And this is just one sample, breast cancer in this case, and you can't see the detail of the colored code, I'm sure, but basically what they were showing was that the cancer was very common in some areas and much, much less common in other areas. The concentration of cancer in this particular case was really very focused, suggesting, of course, something that we all, or I should say confirming something that we already knew more or less in science, namely cancer is a geographically localized disease. That says this, and this in part is a conclusion drawn from prior research before this, but it basically says that cancer is not a product of our genes. Even though cancer and all other physiological events start with genes, they don't necessarily end with genes. And so there's something that goes on between the genetic basis for disease and then the expression of those genes to give the result. So in any case, since it's a geographically localized disease, it suggested to some of my colleagues, in fact at Oxford University from some other kinds of studies, and confirmed here, that cancer is a lifestyle kind of condition. It's a dietary and lifestyle function. So what we're seeing in this case with the study I just showed you on nutrition, sort of put some, gave that some emphasis. Now, in the China study, this is a huge study. It was a joint study between the United States and China and Britain, specifically between Cornell University, University of Oxford, and 2 Chinese academies. And we went across the country. I'd say we, I use that concept a little bit liberally, as my Chinese colleague, Dr. Chen, whose picture you saw there, and his people, his professionals, went across the country and collected information in a total of 130 counties across the country. He collected blood samples and urine samples and food samples, had access to all kinds of information on disease rates, not just cancers, but other diseases as well. And so finally, in 1991, after completing this study, working together on this, we came up with a monograph with a huge volume of information. All kinds of diseases, all kinds of things measured in the blood, and like nutrients and hormones and viruses and you name it. What I was interested in as far as this study was concerned, to go back to what I just said before, I was interested in that broader horizon, to see if what we were focused on in the beginning, involving just protein and liver cancer, might also relate to, in a much broader context, other kinds of diseases. And so, just quickly, I can't get into the details of how we actually went about doing this, But among the diseases that were in fact recorded in China, with data that were considered to be reliable, among all these diseases, it turned out there was basically two sort of collections of disease rates for different counties. So that on the one hand, we had so-called affluent diseases, the cancers, the heart disease, and diabetes, and diseases like this that we tend to see in the West, and much less so in rural areas of China. And on the left, the diseases of poverty, we say, infectious, communicable kinds of diseases. And so we see this segregation, this segregation of these disease types, you know, in this very large population in China. So then we could raise this question, at least I thought it was fair to do. Among all the things we measured in China, what is most associated with the diseases here on the right, let's say, since these are the diseases that obviously get most of us before our time in Western countries? And it turned out there was one thing that we did measure that was highly significantly correlated with this. It was elevated blood cholesterol. Elevated blood cholesterol. That turned out to be, and it was highly significant, those 3 stars, I mean it's significant, the 0.001 level for the statisticians in the group. So what really made this here kind of interesting was this, and that's that blood cholesterol in the Chinese samples among these individuals. The blood cholesterols in rural China ranged from a low of about 90 milligrams per deciliter up to a high of about 170. Much below ours. Their high was near our low. The normal range of cholesterol in the United States in those days was considered more or less the average of like 210, 220 or something of that nature. And in fact, when we first determined these levels with our method in one laboratory, I thought it was wrong. I mean, it was so low, and my colleagues who had been working in this cholesterol areas, that's not possible. But we did go back, used different methods, did different laboratories, checked out this information, and sure enough, the blood cholesterol levels in China are low. Now, all of you, I think, know that the cholesterol story primarily relates to heart disease. That is, the higher the cholesterol level, the higher the heart disease rates. That's been around a long time, kind of an old idea. But the fact is, what we're seeing here in rural China was that cholesterol, if we only get down to about 170 or so, 180, 170, we're not getting rid of all the risk. Going from 170 down to 90, we can actually remove a lot more risk as well. And in fact, in the regions of China where the cholesterol is really low, heart disease is virtually unknown. In fact, one block of data over a period of years for one county, there was something like 265,000 successive death certificates that were recorded without one single case of heart disease. So with now telling you all the other background information on this, it turned out that that's why the Western diseases being associated, as it were, with the blood cholesterol levels. That's why it's so significant, because we're working with cholesterol levels at a very low end of things. One more point, and I don't have this information to show you. Cholesterol in China tends to increase from those low levels and going up like this as they begin to consume more animal-based foods, more animal protein, and as they begin to cut down on the consumption of plant-based foods. So what this suggested, and confirmed with, or supported, I should say, with other kinds of data, is this, very general, and again, very provocative statement. As soon as we start to put in relatively small amounts of animal food in our diet, or as we stray, even a better way to say this, as we stray from the consumption of whole plant-based foods, we don't have to go very far for some of us. We can begin to get in trouble. And so the Western kind of diseases begin to appear. So this, again, is in stark contrast to what, in fact, had been told before in the Western literature, and it was something, of course, that's very exciting. We ended up with a huge block of data. Something like, again, for you statisticians group, we had something like 100,000 statistical correlations between all kinds of things measured in the blood and lifestyle conditions and related to all kinds of disease outcomes. The Chinese government gave to us a lot of information, as I mentioned before, on non-cancer deaths as well. So with all that huge body of data, it becomes a question of how do you analyze this? Do you analyze it bit by bit? Spend a few lifetimes trying to do that? Or you try to sort of do it in some other kinds of ways, aggregating data and seeing what's related to what? In any case, we got to a point that I think this statement here is a fair statement to make as far as the China information is concerned. Namely, after looking at, let's say, 50 or so of the trees in this forest, if I can use that metaphor, that condition, it turns out that the vast majority of hypothetical cause and effect associations favoring less disease reflect the nutrient composition of plant-based foods. Now, there's something, I'm saying something significant here. Plant-based foods, or animal-based foods for that matter, foods relate to our health and the kind of disease we get, especially the degenerative kind of disease like diabetes and heart disease and cancer and so forth. Our foods relate their risk according to their nutrient composition. How much protein, how much fat, how much fiber, how much antioxidants. It just turns out that plant-based foods, in a whole food form, they have the right kind of and the right amount of the enormously complex fiber fraction. They have the right kind of protein. They have an enormous supply of antioxidants that when we start looking at all this information bit by bit by bit, like, it turns out that when you put it all together like that, and then you compare with the nutrients present in animal-based foods, that's when you really begin to see something really interesting. And so the general statement here below that, the more practical kind of statement, consuming plant-based whole foods, less total protein and fat, no animal protein, means less chronic degenerative diseases. I'm talking in this specific case about heart disease, cancer, and diabetes and things like that, as well as, I should say, some autoimmune diseases as well. And that information was consistent with experimental data that had been done before, either on experimental animals or in testing studies, if you will, over a number of different years. So that's kind of a heavy statement, but I think it's one that's, as time is passing, it really turns out to be very significant. At this particular point in time, it was in the early 1990s, in fact, when the New York Times actually heard about our results from China, publicized it in a cover story in, I think, 1991, that it came to the attention of Dr. Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic, a famous surgeon who had been practicing his art for many, many years. And he called me up to, I have to tell this story because he called me up to talk about this because he had been working in the heart disease area. He invited me to a conference that he was organizing. That's when we established our relationship in the early 1990s. And it turned out Dr. Esselstyn, without working on the science end of thing necessarily all that much, simply was doing something on, I mean, I want to tell this because he did it on his own, I did it on my own. It was just two different sort of arenas, if you will. He was taking people with advanced heart disease, giving them whole plant-based foods, and getting remarkable results. Published it here. And I'll just leave it go at that because there's a lot more to that story. I don't really have the time to go into it, and many of you may know that story. But it just turned out that his clinical experience and the science that I was involved in, all of a sudden just came like that, converged. So it was really very exciting, not just for heart disease, but also for other diseases as well. And so when I speak about other diseases, it turns out that when I sort of knew some of this information, I guess, through the years, but when all this information, there's so much more I could tell you, I wish I could, about genes and all the rest of it. I mean, all this information was beginning to converge to a point that was sort of saying that health, however you define it, avoidance of disease, physical conditioning, all these kind of things, I mean, they really work together. And so we decided systematically, my son and I did, to go back and look at the literature a little more carefully about other researchers and other clinicians in years past to ask ourselves, are there people doing anything like this? And as I got into sort of reviewing some of the information, it turned out finally we could assemble a list like this. And the list here, as you can see, shows a rather large number of different kinds of diseases. Some of them, of course, very serious. Some of them are more nuisance kind of diseases. But it turns out all of them, there's really serious literature and evidence showing that, up at the top, the same whole food, plant-based diet prevents, suspends, and or cures all these diseases. Can you think of a pill that can do that? I mean, this is, and I want to emphasize this too. We don't know enough yet. I mean, I'm making a strong statement, I realize. And I can't say, you know, obviously every single person who has a problem is going to be able to solve their problem just with a plant-based diet of this nature. But this effect is so strong compared to everything else we do in medicine, there's no comparison. There's really no comparison. The statement here at the end where it says cures, I really mean that. Until now, we have tended to think in medicine and science, insofar as diet is concerned or nutrition is concerned. We have tended to think and accept over the years that, you know, certain kinds of diets might prevent certain kinds of diseases like heart disease or diabetes and so forth. We talk about prevention, prevention, prevention. That hasn't caught fire really very well because everybody sort of think, oh, I'll leave that. We're not going to worry about what might happen in the future. But here's what we're learning. And to me, this is the most exciting sort of turn of events insofar as this information is concerned for our future thinking. It doesn't just prevent disease, it actually cures disease. And here's what I mean by cure. It doesn't, I don't mean cure in the sense that, you know, you've cleaned up the body completely and it'll never return. I mean it by simply eliminating the symptoms that one experiences for these diseases. If they go away, if those symptoms go away, even though your body still may retain a capacity to go back where it shouldn't be, as long as you don't know the symptoms are there, that's fair enough. To me, that's cure. So that's in the sense of what I'm using cure. And so that's the future of this field that's going to catch fire. It's catching fire now. It's not just about people, oh, I'll do this and so I don't get some disease in the future. People are actually using this and getting results, amazing results. And it seems to be so consistent and so comprehensive and involves so many different kinds of disease conditions. It also promotes superior physical fitness. I think Robert probably can speak to that to some extent. I've had the good fortune of working with some world-class athletes actually in the last 3 or 4 years as this has been coming out. And I continue to discover still yet more really top-notch, world-class, Hall of Fame type of people, you know, who are trying this and discovering better conditioning for their athletic events. Again, not enough time to talk about that. So here's where I am now as far as, I guess I could say, what I thought I knew in the beginning of my career and what I think I know now. And in fact, in the beginning of my career, and unfortunately too many of my colleagues still think this way, they think of nutrition as a function of individual nutrients. We study them that way. In the public, what do? We take an individual nutrient, make a pill into it. We call it a vitamin supplement. We call that nutrition. You know, we're just working on one nutrient at a time as to what specifically it really does. And we tend to assume it involves one mechanism oftentimes, one outcome. That is so fractured. To me, that's not nutrition. Vitamin supplementation, for example, just to illustrate this, is not nutrition. That's pharmacology. That's pharmacology. The nutrition I'm talking about is a situation where all the stuff in food, we can call them nutrients, hundreds of thousands of different kind of chemicals, many of which are operating in a nutritional sense, in the sense that it creates health. It works together. These things work together. And which kind of foods provide those kinds of nutrients at the right kind of level? It's plant-based foods, whole plant-based foods. And I emphasize the word whole, because you can consume a vegan diet, for example. You know, you avoid all animal foods. Some vegans have problems. They have problems because they're not consuming the whole plant-based food. You could take the sugar out of plants, only it comes from plants, basically. You could take the white flour out of plants. You can dump a little bit of oil in it, the good oil, let's say from plants, like Cornell or something like that, and stir it up and you get a Danish. So people tend to use processed foods. You know, there's high in salt, high in fat, high in sugar, white flour. That's no good. So that's just like straying down the road of consuming animal-based foods as well. So the real story here is whole plant plant-based foods. A good mixture, a good quality, and so forth and so on. That's where you get the comprehensive effect from, operating by a whole host of innumerable mechanisms, biologically speaking. So here's my definition for nutrition. You know, I taught the verse of this at nutritional biochemistry at Cornell University for some years, so I was part of the game plan too. Going in the wrong direction. It wasn't until, obviously, we started collecting some information through the years we had to change our minds. But anyhow, nutrition definition involves integrated effects of countless food constituents. I really mean countless. Your guess is as good as mine. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, different kinds of isomers, for those of you in science, that are all kind of working together in really neat ways. It involves infinitely complex mechanisms, and that's why I said that the whole story about mechanism, what I'm talking about here is holism. A bad word in my field, has been. But I'm talking about, you know, how things sort of work in a holistic sense. It involves infinite mechanisms to produce comprehensive health, that meaning, you know, a large variety of different kinds of disease outcomes. So nutrition, let's say, is not everything, obviously. When it's supported by good exercise, very important. Supported by adequate water intake, hydration, good sunshine, rest I should put in there too. When we do it that way as a lifestyle and become accustomed to doing it that way, it's greater than the sum of its parts. It's a biological symphony. We need to come to terms with that kind of understanding of what nature really is and what biology really is, because when we do, if you stop, I mean, it sounds kind of simple maybe. Maybe if you already know this and you use it. But if you think more about it, especially in the context of the way we actually do medicine, the way we actually publicize our information, this is the way we should think about it instead of the alternative. So there's the sort of the practical statement. So in any case, I've gotten very excited about what nutrition can do. You probably heard me now long enough to know I'm pretty excited about it. But I think this information has enormous capacity to really transform, not just a way of thinking, but our way of living and sort of maintaining health. So where does nutrition fit in? It doesn't. In the present state of affairs, it doesn't. This kind of information, you know, to some extent, there's bits and pieces of this information been around for quite a long time. And a few individuals, in fact, have talked about this. You know, Pythagoras talked about this 2,500 years ago. So it's kind of risen up a little bit from time to time. Sometimes get to know it, sort of believe in it kind of thing. But basically, it's not accepted. Public doesn't understand. The public is confused about what nutrition really is. And so it's poorly understood by the public, of course. And there's a couple of reasons for this in an institutional setting. Namely, research funding hardly exists. Let me give you an example. The National Institutes of Health, which is the leading medical research agency in the world, has been at least, up until now, is comprised of 27 institutes and centers and programs. In other words, it's National Institutes, plural, National Institutes of Health. That's NIH, very powerful organization. They really set the agenda. 27 institutes, one for heart and one for cancer, one for this, one for that. Do you know there's one institute called Institute of Nutrition? And here it is the single most important thing we can think about as far as health is concerned. Not one institute. Medical schools don't train in nutrition. There's not a medical school in the United States that really trains young doctors in nutrition. Many of them don't even offer a course, maybe a few courses in some cases. But so nutrition is not trained, not part of our system, our paradigm. National policy and standards, I'm being a little rough here saying that it's corrupted by the food and drug industry, but I mean that. I spent about 20 years of my career actually on expert panels and kind of panels that are bodies that were responsible for, let's say, translating science into public policy. So I've seen it firsthand. I've seen the interface between science on one hand and politics or policy on the other. And unfortunately, that's where most of us getting information from. It's basically who wants to sell what, basically, is where much of it comes from.
I'm going to go on my hands and knees. and this is only my opinion, say, America, I beg of you, read a book called The China Study. The China Study. It's something I've tried to do most of my life. Avoid animal protein and to exercise and eat as much raw as possible. We've got to eat right. Food must be your medicine. Exercise and eat right.
I didn't mean to get into that quite so fast. I want to save a little time to make a remark. I mean, that's Gary Player, by the way, a famous golfer. And when I talked about, you know, some of the leading athletic figures now around the world becoming aware of this or saying things like what he did. When Gary called me now 4 years ago, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, he wanted to know if I minded his going on the Golf Channel and mentioned the China Study. I said, not at all. You know, help yourself. So he did. He got on the Golf Channel and did that. He heard what he told me what he was going to do. And I just got a phone call from one of his associates in the last Masters tournament, of which he still participates. He's allowed to. He's close to 80 years old now. But he carries the book all over in his bag and tells people about it. And so he's been a great missionary for this whole idea. But then more recently, we had another opportunity of seeing someone else come forth too.
How did you lose so much weight? What kind of diet are you on?
The short answer is I went on essentially a plant-based diet. I live on beans, legumes, vegetables, fruit. I drink a protein supplement every morning, no dairy. I drink almond milk mixed in with fruit and a protein powder, so I get the protein for the day when I start the day out. And it changed my whole metabolism, and I lost 24 pounds. And I got back to basically what I weighed in high school. But I did it for a different reason. I mean, I wanted to lose a little weight, but I didn't dream this would happen. I did it because after I had this stent put in, I realized that even though it happens quite often that after you have bypasses, you lose the veins because they're thinner and weaker than arteries. The truth is that it clogged up, which means that the cholesterol was still causing buildup in my vein that was part of my bypass. And thank God I could take the stents. I don't want it to happen again. So I did all this research, and I saw that 82% of the people since 1986 who have gone on a plant-based, no dairy, no meat of any kind, no chicken, turkey. I eat very little fish. Once in a while I'll have a little fish, not often. If you can do it, 82% of the people who've done that have begun to heal themselves. Their arterial blockage cleans up. The calcium deposit around their heart breaks up. This movement has been led by a doctor named Caldwell Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic, Dean Ornish, whom you know, out in California, the doctors Campbell, father and son, who wrote the China Study, and a handful of others. But we now have 25 years of evidence. And so I thought, well, since I need to lose a little weight for Chelsea's wedding, I'll become part of this experiment. I'll see if I can be one of those that can have a self-clearing mechanism. We'll see.
I hope you're healthy for many years and get to see grandchildren for many years
Me
to
too.
come.
That's really the big deal. You know, Hillary and I, we're happy. We love our son-in-law and we admire him, but and we'd like to be around. If there's grandkids, we want to be there to do our part.
Mr. President, good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks for what you do.
I just got apparently President Clinton was in China just recently, and I just got an email, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, where he apparently has been going around China as well and talking about the China Study. I mean, he's really gotten into this. So that's the book, in case you haven't heard of it. One final thing I would like to say: I've had the good fortune of having some young colleagues work with me. One of whom had taken my course at Cornell University on this, Megan Murphy. Others also, mostly from Cornell, to organize online a course on plant-based nutrition. And in that course, we're now able to give, any day now, it's been approved, CME credits for doctors or CEU credits for professionals. We've done this now for going on 2 years, and it's been a very exciting venture. We get students on there taking a series of 3 courses, get a certificate. Some of we don't know who they are when they take the course. We learn later. And I wish I could tell you about some of the stories of some of the people who have gotten on there famous. It's really pretty spectacular. And so I just would like to tell you, my colleagues certainly want me to tell you that, so we have this really nice course. I met someone here that took the course. So there you have it. Thank you very much. I'm actually just about done a second book now. I guess I got the nerve to mention that I've been working on this. I've been saying that I've finished it up for now about 3 years. But in any case, it is close to be done. I'm really now working on this question concerning how is it that we haven't known this before? There's philosophical reasons, historical, cultural, biological, economic reasons. And I'm really excited about one particular idea that we have forgotten about since the days of the ancient Greeks. And I sort of want to reintroduce that whole idea. And once we sort of get a grasp of what that is, it really has ramifications far beyond this story. And your success, I hear a lot of these kinds of stories, people with all kinds of problems. They do this and they recover. It's very gratifying. Yes? That's a really good question. I've been asking the same kind of question, of course, myself, not just for the clinician community, but for my community as well, researchers. And I do have to say there's something that's been happening the last 2 or 3 years. I've been lecturing since the book came out almost 6 years ago now. In the beginning, it was mostly preaching to the choir, obviously, and public groups. But the majority of my talks now are to medical schools and medical conferences. Last year, for example, there were 3 new medical schools in the United States. I was the inaugural speaker in 2 of them. And so it turns out that, and I want to say something about your profession as well as my profession too. You know, we do operate within a certain worldview. We live within a paradigm. We know that. And we don't know that oftentimes, don't know too often enough. But obviously, you know, all of us as individuals, whether we're in professions or not in the professions, we're still subject to the constraints of a system. It's a system of thinking. It's a system in which we have lived for a long time. And that's really what it's about. It's trying to restructure our thinking, restructure the thinking. So I see great hope. Just Saturday, I guess it is. Yes, Saturday, I'm speaking to a conference sponsored by the Northwestern School of Medicine and the Cleveland Clinic. I'm the keynote speaker, in fact, at a conference there on the whole question concerning, you know, what's the relationship is between alternative medicine and traditional medicine. It's happening. It's happening. It's exciting. I'm so gratified to see physicians like yourself, you know, sort of, you're out there, you're on the front line. You're the ones taking care of the rest of us. And it's very nice. Yeah, wait, right in the back? Yeah, good. I'm glad you asked that question. It's a very important part of it. But let me distinguish fat into 2 different categories. There's natural fat in foods, right? And we do need some fat, some oils particularly. The concern that I would have and my colleagues would have is added fat. In other words, we prescribe against the use of fried foods. Try to avoid, you know, adding fat back to your diet. And one of the key sources of added fat is using simply, you know, frying and cooking foods and fat. So it's really the added fat. If we're consuming a whole plant-based food type of diet, that's going to contain around 8-9% or so of total calories, which is about right. That's about right. And so that it's one of the arguments, in fact, when you start thinking about all the different nutrients and you ask oneself, you know, which level of this nutrient do we need and this and that one and so forth and so on, it always seems to converge back to a whole plant-based food diet. You know, whichever nutrient we're talking about. So use a whole plant-based food diet. Don't use added fat, or at least absolutely minimize it as much as possible. Fat, incidentally, is a difficult thing for a lot of people to deal with because it's an addictive response. It's an addiction. And there's evidence, in fact, that when we get accustomed to consuming higher fat intake, we actually see some changes in our brain chemistry, rather like other kinds of chemical addictions. And if we go from that to here, a lot of people have the experience that doesn't taste quite as good as what they would hope it would be. It takes a little while to become accustomed to it. But give it a month or 2 or 3, we begin to change our perceptions. I'm sure many of you probably know this. And so you get to that point, not adding fat, then that's the food you prefer. The same is true for salt. No, that's becoming a bit too reductionist for me. You know, much of our research and our medical practice, as I mentioned before, inferred, resides too much on details that we take out of context and we study. We get results that look impressive. You know, the individual nutrients that we study in isolation at times, we will see things. That's interesting. That looks promising. But the real question is, what happens over the long term? That's when we discover we've just looked at a tree much too long, we forgot what the forest was. And so we can talk about these relationships, and they're infinite, many of which, you know, sort of look promising. But the ultimate test of whether or not any of those kind of observations are really worth considering is, as I like to say, as we said in our book, just try it. I mean, I did say in the book that I can't, you know, be a scientist. I'm trying to be a scientist and objective, of course, about these things. I could not, in fact, when we wrote the book, say obviously that this is going to cure all ills for all people all the time. I mean, that's silly. But I did say, I just basically said, you don't have to accept what I say. Just try it. That's the ultimate test of a good idea. That's the ultimate test. And the kind of thing I think you're inferring, and that some in the country want to talk about, is these high-fat diets, there's this, that, and something else. Those diets don't cure and don't reverse disease. Like, there's no way. That's sort of the bottom line. Yeah. Well, here's my sort of take on that. We are all biologically, we're individuals. We'll have each of us have our own unique biologies. And let's say our susceptibilities to various things. We have our own unique set of genes, some of which are mischievous. We don't know what they are, but we all. And so 95% of us go down and have trouble, have problems before the end. There is a 5% or so that seem to be doing quite well. I mean, there's smokers that will live to be 95 perhaps and say they got there because they were smoking. I'm interested in the other 95%. And I think, and I think I can create some arguments on the basis of the science that it's not surprising to see, 5%, maybe 10% or so, who are doing fairly well, doing everything, I would suggest, the wrong way. The question becomes, though, in that case, did they finally get to the end of their life and just lie down and go to sleep? Or did they suffer some problems along the way? They can live quite older ages, but they may have suffered some problems along the way, number one. Number two, who's to say that the person who dies at, let's say, 90 or so, and not too bad a way, I mean, they were wearing their machine out, could have maybe made it to 115, 110 or something like that. I know, but my point, I'm just using a sort of hypothetical in this particular case, and so, yes, there's variation. But here's another add-on to that question, I think, and that is, are the people, there are two things. We don't know who we are, insofar as our resistance, our susceptibility is concerned. We don't know that until we experience the result, maybe. That's a problem. So then the question becomes, does it hurt people to do this, even those who otherwise might do quite well without doing it? Does it hurt them? Answer, no. I think that's a good thing. Well, I was, in your shoes, very much so. I milked cows. We slaughtered our animals. We had our own eggs and all the rest of it. We did the whole 9 yards. But, my father was always outdoors, always very active, still had his first MI when he was 62, and a fatal MI when he was 70. His brother had a fatal MI when he was 58. His father, my grandfather, had a stroke when he was 73, a fatal stroke. On average, I'm 10 years beyond all of them. Yeah. But you know, I understand what you're saying. You know, it's something to wrestle with. But you know, one of the things that you say, you like meat. I know you like meat. And I liked meat too. I like cheese. You know, and I did that. But you know, after you're sort of off it a while, and you discover those new tastes in plant-based foods. I mean, I think I had some vegetarians in the group here somewhere. So. Yeah. Well, give yourself a chance to train some new tastes. I don't know. Peter, tell me when I should stop. Pardon? Okay. I always like this part anyhow. This is kind of fun. Waiting back there is somebody. It's a good question. Some of Tony Gonzalez, I don't know if you heard the story or not, All-Pro and formerly of the Kansas City Chiefs, now with the Atlanta Falcons, and headed for the Hall of Fame. He's really outstanding. I mean, he tried this and called me and got involved, and now he's gone through 3 football seasons, you know, basically doing this. But he thought that he really still needed some protein supplement. Asked me the same question. I couldn't argue against it for someone who's in that, you know, really muscular and very fit and things. I thought it wasn't necessary, primarily because the average age of death of NFL football players is 56 years. And so, you know, even though they might gain something by having protein supplements early on, especially muscle mass, no question about that, that happens. But the fact of the matter is, so Tony and another guy who's a weightlifter, professional trainer, has gyms, 5 gyms, I think, across the northern part of the country, man by John Hines. I got John Hines and Tony together. And we've been talking about, you know, I had to tell him in my profession, I couldn't give a really good answer to that. And so they've been playing around a little bit. My friend who is, as I say, a trainer, really a very well-built guy to say the least, he first went to plant protein supplement, hemp, and things like that, because he thought he needed it. A little concerned about that because Dean Ornish and his prostate cancer trial that he's been doing actually did not get quite the results he did because he emphasized they should be consuming quite a bit of soy protein, which I think you know, counteracted some of this. But in any case, my trainer friend just called me rather excitingly last summer. He said, now, and you'd have to see this guy to really almost to believe the story, but he is completely off of plant protein supplements too, and he's now in his 40s, and he said he's lifting, pressing, so forth, more now than he did when he was in his 20s. He just has gained immense physical fitness, and he's just very excited about it. So I think I'm inclined to say plant protein supplements are not necessary, and I don't know what President Clinton is using. I think he could be using whey, and I've been waiting for a chance to get him to meet him personally and tell him, stop that. Way in the back. Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm glad you raised that because people who, and most of you know this who are in the community, the recommendation generally made that you should take a B12 supplement. I have not been in the business of recommending supplements really of any kind much, but on this one I listened to my clinical friends first who say that somebody's really low in B12. You do see some symptoms of B12 deficiency apparently, or they do. But on the science side of it, I'm not convinced that we really have the science sorted out on that one, even then. And B12, incidentally, has been used by the people favoring animal foods as a reason for consuming animal foods, because only animal foods produce B12. That's a silly argument. Through a silly argument. We're animals too, and we produce some B12 in the gut, so that's simply incorrect. B12 is produced by microorganisms. And it can be in the soil, it can be in our large intestinal tracts, and in ruminants, you got lots of organisms there in the rumen reticulum in the large stomachs, and they produce quite a lot of B12 in that condition, so it gets in the milk and so forth. And you'll see more B12, of course. And we don't see B12 hardly at all in plant foods these days, unless you grow it in really good organic soil. And there's good research showing that B12 can be taken up from the soil because there's more microorganisms in the soil. It's an argument for using, quite frankly, organic foods to some extent, I think. Well, let me try to answer it, by just from a scientific perspective. We don't really have evidence, the kind of evidence that I'd like to see, that people consuming organic food are distinctly better than people not consuming organic food, number one. We just don't have that. Because it's really difficult to do, almost impossible. You have to do it for quite a long time. So we don't have the kind of evidence that theory would like to have, on one hand. On the other hand, we've got quite a lot of indirect evidence and supportive evidence to suggest that consuming organic foods is better. And it makes sense. It just makes sense. And I think that kind of argument, indirect evidence, is good enough for me to suggest that using organic food is probably a good idea. We should really try to do that because we're doing all kinds of dumb things to our food. Best way to get vitamin D. That's a really big issue these days. Everybody's talking about it because we know that in northern climates, the vitamin D levels tend to go down. What is not told to the public, however, is that the vitamin D levels that tend to go down in our blood, that's the storage form of vitamin D. And our storage can go up and down like that. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have consequences. Because the vitamin D that we actually use is not the storage forms. That has some activity, yes. But it gets metabolized as the body needs it into a metabolite of vitamin D that's 1,000 times more active. And the body is the master at controlling how much of that converts from storage to this. And so all of a sudden we see our storage going down in the cold months when there's not so much sun for good reasons, because that's where you get our vitamin D from. It tends to go down. Oh, you got to give the vitamin D. I have been a skeptic of that whole philosophy. And in fact, just 2 weeks ago, I think now, a policy committee, scientists, went back and really looked at the literature fairly carefully on all the vitamin. There's been a lot of research on that. They just concluded, made a conclusion that's basically supporting what I just said. And they've really looked at the literature. It's really angered, I should say, a lot of people in this country who are selling vitamin D supplements. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much again.